There is beauty in the Wasteland. Not in its craftsmanship per se, but in its history. The fictitious events that shaped the world. The thought that went into the styles of the time. That is what's so interesting about the look of Fallout. Unfortunately, all of this gets overshadowed by the destruction. The Wasteland is just that, a wasteland. It can be boring, devoid of life, and that's the point, but is that a good setting for an exploratory video game? That's why it's so important that Fallout 4 is set in such a busy city like Boston. Any splashes of life and character help. It should be refreshing when you finally see something besides rocks and dead trees. If the designers didn't focus on the small details like the mid-century set dressing, then this world would have no character. It would just be barren emptiness. They make a conscious effort not to put any green plant life in the wasteland either. Anything that was once alive would have been eradicated during the nuclear holocaust. That includes plant life. But this greatly reduces the color palette, something they were hoping to improve on since Fallout 3, which is just a muddy gray blob. We can also look at an apocalyptic game like The Last of Us, which handles its weathering quite a bit differently. Look at how much green plant life there is. The theme was way different here. Nature is reclaiming the land. But man, is it gorgeous to look at. It's refreshing, and I know the wasteland is supposed to be dreary, and it does a good job of that. It's more of an unfortunate setting. The game also does a good job of not being as brown as, say, Skyrim. Fallout 4 works with what it can to provide color variations, painting buildings, cars, and other objects in bright greens, reds, blues, or yellows. Colors you won't normally see in nature, providing a very pleasing contrast. This is where the world's design history becomes so important. It's the only splash of life that we have left to hold on to. I guess there's a metaphor in there somewhere. Hey, I'm an artist, not a writer. Somebody else figure that out. The most interesting part of Fallout's design is the 1950s influence. 1950s design is supposed to be clean, optimistic, a window to perfection. It's a very interesting juxtaposition against the horrid, miserable wasteland, which is the actual setting for the series. Now, a lazy artist would just paint a skyline that looks cool and be done with it. It's easy to paint wreckage after all. You just scribble around a bunch, right? Well, with that mentality, you certainly won't be getting hired by Bethesda anytime soon. They started with sketches by Adam Adamowicz. He made some of the fantastic imagery you see in Oblivion, Fallout 3, and Skyrim. Unfortunately, in 2012, Adam lost his battle with lung cancer at age 43. At a loss without their friend and main concept artist, they cracked open his sketchbook from Fallout 3 to get some inspiration for how this wasteland should look. These sketches are very rough on purpose. It's supposed to look like a wreck, but the goal here is just to get as many ideas out on paper as possible. Shape, contrast, and line weight are most important. Line weight can be used to show depth and gravity. You're only working with black and white, so any sort of variation helps. After asking, what would Adam do? And getting majorly inspired, the Fallout 4 team got to work on creating a new world, starting from the very base layer and working their way up to the rundown wasteland we know. They took details from a lot of great design influences that, frankly, get lost in all of the wreckage. They could have just started in the setting that Fallout 4 takes place in, but Bethesda's artists had higher standards than that. They more or less built out the entire world's history. You see, Fallout's world is built around a lot of parameters, which could make concepting a challenge. It has to be 1950s retro, but futuristic. Pulpy, but decayed. This world has our history with a ton of different American design influences, but the timeline diverged in the 1950s where the design philosophy sort of froze, but technological progression didn't. There was a heavy focus on nuclear power. To dictate this, the concept artists drew a ton of inspiration from atomic age design. There is very little evidence of this perfect future before it gets all dystopian on us. The artists took the time to draw out a completely progressive Boston, consisting of buildings that were built after the Fallout series' timeline diverged from our own. The primitive buildings of Boston's past would have been dwarfed by the new architecture. This is an optimistic future. Its bright colors contrast well with the old gray concrete and steel of the past. Now, take that optimistic future and rip it all down, ruin it. Pretend a bomb went off in it, because it did. And we're still not done. Take that and age it 210 years. After the nuclear holocaust of 2077, we start to see a new design aesthetic. Now, we start to see the Boston we know from Fallout 4. Technological progression gets pushed back. Everything is very primitive. Even though we have all of that beautiful design work, all that alternate history, it has to be more or less ruined for the narrative of the game. All of that history went from being prominent design influences to subtle. Did you see all of the cultural shifts? There's a lot of alternate history here, and all of that history should dictate the aesthetic. So with all of that in mind, imagine building this world. Imagine your job is to rebuild the Boston skyline based on these parameters. You have to ask yourself a ton of questions. Which design era should we be replicating? Is it 1950s design? Is it futuristic? Is it decayed enough? It depends on what the area calls for. The Institute is one of the only places with a clean, futuristic look. You can see the atomic age design influence in the computers and the rounded shapes of the medical equipment. Its stark contrast from the rest of the game makes it really stand out. But most places need to have a little bit of grit to them. They need to be aged 210 years. Does this mean the concept artist drew two versions of every single piece just to show how it was weathered? Not necessarily, but they did do this for some areas. While it's important to get a feel for the history, concept artists don't typically have a lot of time. Drawing a whole set twice would be very time-consuming. Painting a few set pieces taking place prior to 2077 was enough. However, a lot of the set dressing was designed with both time periods in mind. First drawn pristine with some color variations, then weathered. The weathering process is actually quite fun. Most of these objects are painted metal, so besides the cracks, dust, and scratches, there's usually a lot of rust. This could all be painted in by hand. But there's other techniques that work too. There are Photoshop brushes that apply a rust effect or even random scratches. There's even decals you can get, transparent PNGs that you can just paste onto a piece. It helps to paint around the effect though, to blend it in as best you can. We need a word for this stuff. The act of designing based on the history of the world. Designing sequentially. Perhaps the best example of designing sequentially is the fashion and the character design. They did it to the mailman. They even weathered this guy's face. Some of these guys went through a ton of design iteration. The 1950s influenced design is obvious. Take what's there and make something new out of it. Put some holes in it. Not only does it have to look like it's been through hell, but it has to look very DIY. Like it was put together to serve a function or to show that it's all that they could find. Similar to the scavenging we see in the weapons, items, and enemies. But we can spend a whole nother episode on that. History, color, and architecture are what add life to the otherwise dead and barren landscape. There are a lot of rules and limitations that make concepting this world very difficult. Even as a wasteland, it still has to be interesting. But what do you guys think? Do they do a good job? Is it interesting enough? Is there anything that you'd like to have seen done differently? Leave it in the comments below, and if you like this video, absolutely ruin that like button. You get it? Like, they ruined this game? Not in a bad way, like they weathered it, because of the nuke. You know what? Just forget I said anything. Thank you all for being here and for supporting us on our Patreon. You guys are what make these videos possible, and don't forget, you can see these videos early at just the $3 level and provide feedback at just the $5 level. Talk to us. Be a part of that community. You can also talk to me on Twitter at Bob Wulff and tell me any suggestions you have for this show, anything you want to see, let me know and I will do it. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in another video. Have a good week.